All right. Well, good evening, everyone who is here joining us tonight on the 25th anniversary of the Million Men March. I am Dr. Abdul Khabeer, Senior Editor with Sapelo Square, and I'm joined tonight with our brother, our good brother, Zaheer Ali, who is History Editor at Sapelo Square. But before he took on that esteemed role with Sapelo, Zaheer Ali is an oral historian who believes that in order for us to tell powerful stories, we must first commit ourselves to listening to them openly, actively, and deeply. For nearly 2 decades, he has worked as a listener, amplifier, and preserver of the stories of often marginalized voices. His oral history interviews have informed a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Malcolm X, spawned a viral video on Muslim bakers, and inspired a critically acclaimed art installation. His current focus is on leveraging the power of American Muslim storytelling for social and cultural change as Senior Fellow of the Pillars Fund Muslim Narrative Change Cohort for 2020, and congratulations, as an Open Society Foundation Soros Equality Fellow for 2020-21. And because there's so many things we can say about Zaheer. But the reason why we're here tonight in particular, right, is because Zaheer was a part of he was an assistant to the March he's assistant to the Million Man March's national director, Dr. Benjamin Chavez. And so I want to invite, so welcome Zaheer. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're really excited to talk to you tonight. And, I've known you for a while, and I actually didn't think I knew you were part of the sort of organizing committee for the Million Man March. So my very first question is how did that happen? How did you end up a part of this effort?
Well, it is, I had actually just got out. I was 1 year out of college, but the talk about the Million Man March had been happening while I was in college because the call sort of went out in early '94. And I just, I think many people, we can talk about why this resonated, but I was just I got to be in DC for this. So I basically came back to the DC area where I grew up, and I was trying to figure out how am I going to get involved with this effort. And one day in the summertime of 1995, I think May or June, I just walked up into the office. It was headquartered at the Phi Beta Sigma fraternity headquarters in Northwest Washington. I walked into the office of Dr. Benjamin Chavez, who was the national director, and his assistant then, Gary Foster. And I just said hey, I want to help. What can I do? There was no interview. There was no resume. There was no recommendation. And this sort of speaks to the real do for self spirit of the Million Man March. They had an event that they had to invite people to, and I helped, mobilize and get those invites out. I brought my little laptop with me, which for a few weeks was the only computer at the Million Man March office. And my printer, which was the only printer at the Million Man March office. And, this is 95. So, we are not all on computers. There's no internet. Email is only university based. We had to, I did this mail merge, which wowed people, right? So you could do personalized letters really quickly. And we had to fax these letters. And there was in the office of the national director of Phi Beta Sigma fraternity was this man named Lawrence Miller, who's since passed on. May God be pleased with him. And he had a fax machine in his office because there was no fax machine in the Million Man March office. He had a fax machine in his office. It was one of those with the phones on it, and it rolled with the heat transfer paper, and you had to feed the pages one at a time.
Wow.
Me and this other sister who's a volunteer there, or who's working there as well, Sister Stacy Muhammad, we sat there and fed 150 invites, and each is a different number, and fed that into that machine, and then of course made the calls, the phone calls to follow up, and it was a great turnout. And that's when Dr. Dr. Chavis was like, so tell me about yourself. Interview came after the job.
He's like, okay, this one this
is keeper. And but that really kind of speaks to the Million Man March, which was a movement, a spirit that moved among the people, very much out in front of any attempts to contain it. And that the leadership, even the leadership that envisioned the march, we spent a lot of time just trying to keep up with the spirit of the people. People were calling the office, and we didn't have all of the information because the logistics were still being worked out. This is sort of unheard of. How are you going to like bring 1 million people into Washington, D.C. in like 5 or 6 months? And people were like, okay, well, people just like, I'm just gonna be there. Y'all, at some point y'all gonna tell us where we park the buses. At some point you're gonna tell us where we need to go. At some point you're gonna tell us what time we need to get there, but we're just coming. Right. And we sort of had to catch up with that spirit.
So I'm assuming, what month did you join the effort?
End of May, early June. And wow. it was really, there was one phone with 2 lines. I mean, I'm just because like we have this like real triumphant, and people can see in the background, and people know that that this was a tremendous outcome, right? And so we tell these triumphant stories, but I don't think it takes away to talk about how humble this effort was at the beginning. And June, it was slim pickings. We were like, trying to make this happen. And it's like no one knew what was going to happen. We just were trying to just get the word out, communicate with as many people as possible. There was a plan that they developed to establish these local organizing committees. So they were called LOCs, and the LOCs just became the thing. And I think there were over 300 LOCs by the time the march happened. And one of my jobs was to stay in touch with the LOCs and do sort of that, get the field reports. And it was a really amazing chance to get to be in communication with our communities around the country. And even from places that, look, I'm an East Coast boy, right? So like Denver is calling, like Portland is calling, and I'm just like, Portland, like just like
we got people in Portland,
yeah. And but fuck Salt Lake City, like so it's just like these places, and I got a sense of like where our people are and what kinds of concerns they had. It was like a crash course in running a campaign. I mean, I feel like I came out of that experience understanding what field organizing is, and also just like massaging the very different approaches that people brought to their organizing work. Sometimes those approaches were very different ideologies, but how to like keep people sort of like focused on keep their eyes on the prize. So
right.
that was my job. And then I became Dr. Ben's assistant. And so just sort of keeping track of his travels, because he was traveling around trying to organize and, of course, doing press. And, and so I got a chance to work closely with him. And I will say this about him that I think is really important. He was one of the, I can say one of the few adults I've encountered doing that kind of work who was so secure and confident in what he was doing and what he could do, that he was never threatened by creating spaces for other people, especially young people, to work. And so, he was always trying to bring us in the room. He was always talking to me and talking to some of the other staff people about some of the challenges, about the things that he learned, about his strategies and why he decided to go or think or speak or write in this way. And he was very deliberative, and we sort of got experience in like witnessing some of that deliberation. And that was because he was never threatened. And I was 22 years old. I'm not threatening anybody. But, sometimes we encounter people who just like are holding on.
Yes.
And they don't want to like it's not like pass the torch, but they don't just want to even let your hand touch the torch. And he was not that kind of a person. So it allowed me to do a whole lot more and learn a whole lot more.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we'll get to this later though too. I think the kind of lessons, right? The various different kinds of lessons that we can take, right, from the Millionaire March sort of are numerous. But before we get into sort of lessons, so you said you just kind of heard about this march and you went down to this office and you're like, I want to be down, right?
Yes,
and so
yes.
Can you give us a little, so that's your personal story, but can you give us maybe some broader context? Like what was going on? Like how did we end up with over a million Black men in DC in 95?
Yeah. I mean, and I think part of this has to, we look at the 1980s, which was devastating our communities, especially with AIDS and crack and the violence associated with the crack epidemic. And towards the late 80s, you see the emergence of this represented in the culture, like NWA Straight Outta Compton and the Ice-T's movie Colors. People start talking about gang violence, even, hip hop, like the Stop the Violence movement with the song Self-Destruction. And so the framing, it's interesting that like Black on Black crime is being sort of weaponized by right-wing conservatives today. But in the 80s, this was the framing that the Black community was using to like just try to get people like, if you don't care, just like care about our community, like, think about this in terms of the self-harm that you're doing, and appeal to people's sense of community. And so you had that happening. Movies like Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society. So culturally, there was that sense that this was a crisis. There were a series of gang summits that were happening as people were trying to establish truces. And, Dr. Chavis, Benjamin Chavis, who had become the national director of the march, was involved in some of that in the 90s. Of course, Minister Farrakhan had a whole tour that he was doing called Stop the Killing Tour. He was one of the leaders at the time who identified the war on drugs as a war on Black youth. I mean, it just called it that, just called it the war on Black youth, and went around the country mobilizing around that. In 1994, of course, is the passage of the crime bill, the infamous crime bill, which was so complicated because in order to get even the minuscule provisions for crime prevention work and resources that members of the Congressional Black Caucus wanted, they had to support this bill. And so a large number of Black elected officials supported this bill. Mayors were calling for this bill. I mean, things were so dire. You had mayors calling for the National Guard, right? Like to come into our cities because they didn't have a handle on this. And so this is the environment that out of which Minister Farrakhan began holding meetings with men-only meetings. And it wasn't just the nation, right? The nation had emerged certainly as an important presence in these communities as violence interrupters. But so had Sunni Muslims, right? You have Masjid al-Taqwa in Brooklyn, where they had organized anti-drug patrols in 1988 and I think 87, 88, and doing some of that same kind of work. So this is part of the Black Muslim tradition of, protecting our communities, and not protecting our communities in ways that criminalized our people, but protecting our communities in ways that tried to provide alternatives for our people, right? So the violence interruption work. So all of this is sort of like feeding a sense in the Black community broadly that the Muslims might have something, right? Like there might be something about the way that the Muslims are doing this that seemed to speak to, especially the young men who were getting caught up in this cycle of violence, to the point where like Christianity Today was like publishing articles saying like the women are all in the church, the men are all in the mosque. I mean, there was already a gendering of this issue in the way that people thought and talked about it. And so you had that context. And then, so by that time in 94, Minister Farrakhan held a men-only meeting in New York City. It was, I think, the first one. And I think like 17 or 18,000 men came out to see him at the Armory in Manhattan. And he just sort of like, you know, in his words, he saw the words leaving his mouth, and he couldn't call them back in. And those words went and just like ignited this spark among people who felt like we needed this like coming together, this experience of community, because, you know, it wasn't just about like managing the representation of Black people to white people. It was managing how we saw ourselves, right? Like to the point where like we had become so convinced of our own danger. You had people like Jesse Jackson being like, I cross the street or get nervous when young Black men are behind me. You had like this tense where people would be like, if you looked at a brother the wrong way, it might start a fight. Certainly if you like accidentally bumped into somebody, it might start a fight, because people were so on edge, and that this notion of how to like represent yourself as a young man or as a man was was narrowly constructed around using violence to like regulate that. I think that, you know, people were like, yeah, we need something. And so this call went out, and people began gravitating towards it. And, you know, most of the leaders didn't jump in. I mean, it was a different kind of respectability politics, because of course, the controversies around Minister Farrakhan and an ongoing feud with members of the Jewish community, many people kept an arm's length distance from him, and they were like, I don't know anything about that. I don't know. But the people on the ground were like, y'all haven't delivered, right? It was a sort of a rejection of establishment approach to politics and movement work that was reflected as well.
Right. I mean, I think a couple of things you said reminded me of like, so one, this idea you were saying that they felt like the Muslims had something going on, right? And I feel like, you know, when you think about the history of Islam, or the reemergence of Islam, right, in Black communities in the United States, from the Nation of Islam to the Ahmadis to Sunni Shia, I think there is this general sense that, you know, I think people who came to Islam, or they were drawn to Islam because they thought there was something different here, and something, they had something going on, right? And there's a lot of personal development, right? A lot of emphasis on personal development that was tied then to community development, right? And a lot of also just kind of like in these kind of changes, right? In these outward changes and movement, you know, to show that we're different, right? We're doing things in a different kind of way. And I think it's interesting, though, this idea of the gender that you're talking about, this idea that the women are in the church and the men are in the mosque, because, you know, one, there is definitely, I think, in the way we think about the civil rights movement and Black power movements, is definitely, right, this kind of masculinist, Black nationalist, right? Like, that's what it means, right? Like, that's the image. Like the Black man, a strong, powerful Black man, is the image of Black freedom, right?
Yes.
And in a lot of ways. And so that made me think about some of you mentioned controversial, right? And so you think about some of the controversies around the march itself. And one in particular, you know, was, I think, around gender. Now, I'll say that, you know, and because I want to hear your thoughts on this, you know, I was, I think, 17 when the Million Man March happened. And, you know, I'm from I guess we would call Sunni Black community, right? So we weren't like down with the nation, but definitely down with the idea. So if I was male, I probably would have went to the Million Man March, right? because like this was the thing, and so because, right, in terms of this idea of Black men and being a Black woman, and the ways in which people feel like, well, Black men are not, they're not doing what they need to do for us, and so this is an opportunity for them to kind of like get it together, right?
Yeah.
But on the flip side, it's like, how can we do this if we're not all there, right?
Yeah.
So could you speak to some of that?
Yeah, you know, and I don't certainly want, because there were people my age who picked up on this and spoke about it critically. So I don't want to be like, oh, I was young, I didn't. But the mindset that I had at the time is the one that I'm gonna try to get into, and I no longer have that mindset. So it takes a little bit of a journey to get back into it. so I think that to your point about like the whole thing of how Muslims, they had this reputation in the Black community as this, Islam was this thing that provided restoration of wholeness, right? And for men and women, and sometimes in different ways, right? And so people witnessed their family members or their friends or people who had become Muslim sort of achieving a sense of wholeness that they maybe had not seen or experienced before. And so part of that wholeness is, yes, I put rehabilitation in quotes, but a sort of reconstruction or rehabilitation of manhood and womanhood. And some of this is rooted in nationalist ideas of gender roles. Some of this is rooted in Christian ideas of gender roles, Black religious experience. Some of this is rooted in Muslim ideas of gender roles. And one of them is the idea of gender separation in many kinds of like social development and leadership development. And so in the Nation of Islam, you had these two classes. You had the Fruit of Islam, which was the class for all of the men, and you had the MGT GCC, which was the Muslim Girls Training General Civilizations class, which was the class for women. And so you can already see the class for women, it has the word girl in it, it has civilization in it. And so like there's civilizationist discourse, there's like a throwback to 19th century Victorian ideas about, cult of domesticity. And so there's already that there. But, I wasn't versed in that language, right? I wasn't versed in those ideas. I just felt that there needed to be a space for men to, sort of come experience a wholeness in a context where there wasn't a sense of having to fight or compete or, one up each other. And it's not saying that people did that because they were trying to attract women. That's not what I'm saying. But there was this sense that, the sort of Western idea of manhood was so dependent on a certain kind of performance in front of women. Like, what would happen if you took that away, right? And so that said, women were integrally involved in this organizational effort. And I say that, and I'm like, I wonder how that sounds, because, women have always been integrally involved in the organizational effort. And, women's labor, not unlike any other movement, was critical to the march, the Million Man March, and its success. And it wasn't just like women making photocopies, right? Or phone calls. There was, Minister Farrakhan had drafted a vision statement for the march, and it was circulated to several women leaders, people like Dr. Dorothy Height, the late Dr. Dorothy Height, the National Council of Negro Women, the Reverend Barbara Skinner, Cora Masters Barry, who was the first lady of Washington, D.C. at the time, the wife of Marion Barry, and some others. And they were like, yeah, that's not going to work. So the initial, it's interesting. So the initial tagline of the Million Man March was like, the Million Man March, a day of atonement. When they got finished with it, it was a day of atonement and responsibility. Right? Because they were like, stop saying, tell the women stay at home, like use different language. And I think to Minister Farrakhan's credit, he didn't, I saw the markup, right? I saw the first draft and I saw their draft. And he, like we didn't have Google Docs back then, but or track changes, but he did the equivalent of like accept all edits. Like he was like, whatever they suggested was incorporated. And so that, that suggests to me that it wasn't just like women doing the work. They were also helping to shape the thinking behind how the march was being articulated. They certainly did a lot of organizational work. Women like Karen Spellman, who was an organizer from SNCC, who was an events producer in DC, was one of the key women in shaping the program in terms of like what happened on stage. So women were very much involved. There was this sense, though, that men needed a place to gather as a sort of kind of rites of passage. And so the Million Man March was and I think very much that day was styled as a kind of rites of passage. And look, women came. I saw women. Wasn't lots, right? Like most of the people there were men.
Right.
And no one said that I saw or even heard from women who came said nothing other than they were respected. No one was like, you ain't supposed to be here. You need to go home. Like people were just like, welcome, sis, And so, that I think that was how I saw it. Now that said, there are these aspirations to patriarchy that are very much present in our communities. And I think what people want, they want partners. They want partners who live up to their responsibilities, who live up to their promises, who support and care and protect mutually, right? And sometimes that's articulated as a quest for the same kind of position as a white patriarch. And so the language is like, about heads of households, and there's this sort of pathologizing families that are non-traditional, or relationships that are non-traditional, or roles that are non-traditional. And I think that, that was present. I'm not going to be like, that wasn't there. That was absolutely present.
Yeah.
There was very much like, we need to restore men as the head of the households. But I will say that amongst the people in the field, amongst the people in the audience, there was a great diversity of how people understood those messages for themselves. And so I wouldn't want to like cast that blanket over the men who were in attendance, that these were men who were seeking to go back home and rule, have dominion over the women in their lives. I think genuinely people were like, I have much more work to do to live up to my end of the partnership that I have entered into, that I desire to enter into, or that I have children that I need to be more responsible to, not to have dominion over them, but to be that human being with that kind of dignity. And I think that was, to me, that was very present, and helped me at the time feel better about the very important criticisms that many women and progressives were leveling at the march.
Yeah, and I mean, I think too, what's interesting, I think you talk about the people and who come. I think with movements in general, right? You don't necessarily always agree with everything, right? But there's a spirit, there's a point, there's something that you can connect to. And that's kind of what you build off of, right? That's what you build off of. That's what brings you to the table. And so I can see that, like, and even like, I think for some, like, you think of some of the Black feminists sort of like critiques or support, right, of this, right? Because, the idea that, if gender matters, right? If we're having gendered experiences, then there are particularities, right?
Yeah.
For Black people who are gendered male versus Black people who are gendered female, right? And so there needs to be a space and a possibility, right, for sort of understanding what that kind of means, right? And then so that I can see people being supportive, like, this is cool. Let's let them do that. I mean, I can also see, you mentioned this idea of a space where there are no women, but there's 1 million people in DC and all the cameras are there. That's a right for posturing as well. So
yes.
I can see that. But I know for me personally, during the time, I remember the sentiment around my community, like both the Muslims and the non-Muslims, the Black folks that I was around, was just like, this is something that we need to do, right? And the brothers need to go. We need to support them. That was kind of the
I mean, I think that was a general sense. And I mean, there's certainly a diversity of opinion among women, right? Who have different ideas of what empowerment sounds like and looks like and is articulated as. And so I don't want to tokenize any women who were like supporting the march or who were present at the march and say like, well, we were, that's like, we're good because we have those 5 women. That's not, that's not, I don't want to do that either, but only to acknowledge, as you said, that there were people who, found value in what this experience could do for the people who participated in it.
And so, I guess so. You have Minister Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam, right? You have a million people coming. Like even I saw this. I was looking up while we were preparing for today, and I saw this NBC like clip.
Yeah,
that was from the time about the march, and the first thing they said was like, "and the controversial leader."
right, right.
And so I wonder maybe if you can spend just a little bit just kind of talking about other controversies that might that surrounded this effort.
Yeah. So I think one of them was, had to do with the fact that this was being led by a Muslim. Now, within the Muslim community, of course, we have so many clear differences that people talk about, like, oh, they ain't Muslim, they ain't this and that. Outside of our communities, people don't make those distinctions. They just like, they Muslim, right? And so there were many Christian communities that were uncomfortable going to a march that was called and led by a Muslim or by Muslims. And, the Million Man March is the first time in American history, I think, that a Muslim voice became the sound articulator of sort of Black public morality, however you want to, the kind of moral conscience of Black America in that moment was a Muslim. And this is remarkable because so much of our Black freedom movement is told from the perspective of what the church did. And that's not to diminish what the church did, but it's to say that the Black religious experience has always been much more diverse than just the Christian Protestant experience. And I think this sort of came to the surface with the march. There one pastor, I think James Meeks in Chicago, said we can't follow a man who uses the Quran, right? So that ain't even about like, what do they think of Elijah Muhammad? What do they think of Barack Muhammad? They're like, they use a Quran. Like we can't, so there was a lot of work that had to be done to build up the ecumenical, spirit of the march. And I think that's where Dr. Chavis, who was himself, Christian and a reverend, could work with some of the members of the Christian community. Of course, the more Black nationalist Christian communities, they were down. They were like, we got this. We understand Black liberation theology. We get it. But so there was an unease about, like, are they going to call all of the men and make them take the Shahada? Like, are they going to like convert all of the men? Is this going to proselytize for Islam? And so there was that nervousness. And I think among the Muslim community, some of the same reasons, right? People were like that. We don't want to give legitimacy to the Nation of Islam and Minister Farrakhan's expression of Islam. And so, Imam Warathuddin, may Allah be pleased with him, actually told his followers not to participate. He discouraged his followers from participating. They didn't stop him because, again, like what happens on, this is one, like we have this bird's eye view. We like look at what leaders are saying and what they're doing. And on the ground, people are a lot more nimble and are a lot more responsive to their realities on the ground. So folks from Masajid came, like there are pictures of people performing Salat in the middle of the Million Man March, right? So, and they're not wearing bow ties. So like, it's clear that Muslims came. But so there was that discomfort. And I think the final thing was because of the spiritual sort of organizing principle of atonement, there were progressives who were very nervous about bringing all of these people to Washington. And people would be like, to atone for what? Like, what demands are you making on the government? What demands are you making on the government? I think people felt that it was lacking in a sort of policy recommendations, because I think they think back to the 1963 March on Washington sort of came packaged around the delivery of the Civil Rights Act, right? Like, we want this bill passed. And so we're going to come here to like make that point. And, I think that was a concern too.
So, I want to, we have a question, but we have a question, but I'm going to hold that because I think it's going to come back to what you're saying. But I wanted to sort of just, kind of like, before we get to the questions, I have one question for you, just if you could like describe for us. So I wanted, so this picture behind you, right? So I'm going to So figure this out. I'm gonna share my screen, right? Okay. And I want you to kind of just take us there, in terms of like just what did it feel like? So this is the picture. Tell us about this picture.
Yes.
Right,
so this picture is an aerial view. This is I think the photographer is Margaret Keating. It's that from the Library of Congress collection. And it's one of the few that it's like sort of, because it's Library of Congress, it's public domain, which is why we're good showing it. But what this picture does not capture is the sort of wings on either side that were also like the Pennsylvania Avenue and Constitution Avenue, which are the two avenues that sort of run parallel to the Washington National Mall, were also packed, right? And this is a view from the Capitol. This is the other thing that was unique about this march, right? So the March on Washington in 1963 was staged at the Lincoln Memorial with the people's backs turned away from the Capitol. People who aren't used to the geography of the space. So you have, I'm just going to come down this. So you have like the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, and then the U.S. Capitol, which is where Congress is, right? So the March on Washington were people facing away from the Capitol towards the Lincoln Memorial. And there were all these kinds of symbolisms, 1963, 1863, the quote unquote great emancipator, la-di-da. This mall was staged with the people facing the Capitol, which is actually more in the spirit of what A. Philip Randolph had in mind when he articulated the idea for a March on Washington in 1941, which is to have the people march into the Capitol and shut it down. Like that was his vision in 41. So this march was actually having the people facing the Capitol, and in a different, and so that's important.
Wow.
The day of this march, though, let me just say I don't think I slept that whole weekend. Because it was work, and I was just like, we just like didn't know what was happening. Like there was this nervousness, there was this apprehension. Look, in 1963, when John F. Kennedy heard about the March on Washington, he said, and I'm just paraphrasing, but I'm getting the expletive right. He was like, they're liable to come here and shit all over the Capitol. Right? That's what John Kennedy thought of the activists who were coming. This is out of his recorded tapes in the White House, right? So if they would say that about an integrationist, multiracial, very beloved community demonstration, imagine what people were thinking and saying about the idea of 1 million Black men who had been criminalized by our legal system, who had been portrayed as gang members by our news media and by Hollywood, what they were thinking about 1 million of those brothers coming to DC. So there was like panic, DC shut down, Bill Clinton got out of town, the Congress closed session, and instead had to open up the building for us because we occupied it, right? Because we were staging our event there. But there was all this, like, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how this is going to go. I love working with Dr. Ben Chavis. He was always like an optimist to the point where I'm like, is he BSing? Like, like we used to call him hype. We used to call him Hype Muhammad. We were like, here go Hype Muhammad with this. You're like, really? Is that going to happen? So there was like, we didn't know, but we started getting reports of people who were driving down from New York that weekend. And they said, like, when they stopped on the turnpike, every stop was just like filled with men, brothers, buses and cars. People were just sort of like nodding their heads, being like, yeah, we going to, very much like you saw in Spike Lee's Get on the Bus film. That weekend in DC, if you drove around, you stopped at a stoplight, another car, brothers will pull up next to you. People would roll their windows down just to say peace. I mean, it was like a whole vibe. And so at about 4:00 in the morning, we got to the mall, and people had already camped out and stayed overnight. And we just saw a stream of brothers just like, it was just like out of nowhere, it seemed like. And that's when I remember turning to Sister Stacy, and I was like, I think this is happening. Like, at 4:00 in the morning on Monday, October 16th, I was like, yo, this might actually happen. So I drove, we parked, and I had a chance to walk through the crowd, and it was that the spirit, I never felt that in my life. People were just, you saw the multi-generational families, fathers and sons. You saw people helping strangers, people like, brother, peace, brother. Everybody was like, peace, brother. People like, salam alaikum. People were just like, everything was like, brother, this. Nobody was like worried about bumping shoulders or stepping on your feet, or people were just like, it was just, people were there and so focused, and they brought that spirit there and sort of consecrated that ground. And by the time I made it into the Capitol, I was so beat. And this is the truth, the God's honest truth. I fell asleep. I fell asleep in one of the like holding areas where like some of the so-called VIPs were. I had like my coat over me. I was just knocked out. And I just remember waking up, sitting next to T.C. Carson, the actor from Living Single, who played Kyle Barker. And he just sitting there looking at me. He was like, brother, it's been a long weekend, huh? I was like, yes, sir. But it was just the beauty, like Will Smith chartered a plane for the men cast members of the Fresh Prince and brought them all there. It was just incredible. The spirit was just incredible. I'd never experienced that in my life. And there's a lot of talk about like who was on stage and what people on stage said, but the God's honest truth, that the real action at the Million Man March was what was happening out among the people in attendance. That was where the real transformation was taking place or being evidenced.
We had one question about the numbers. Was it a Million Man March?
So this is so interesting. The Park Service gave their official count at 400,000. And I think there were like 400,000 Metro rides that morning. So like, we of course we all got slick when we was like 3/5 of a person. Did y'all do that count? Did y'all do the constitutional count, or did you do the human rights count? I think, and of course the organizers responded, and there was a scientist I think based at Boston University who used satellite imaging and put the estimate at 800,000 to 1.2 million. And I think the images that scientist used was from a specific, like later in the day when people were maybe tapering off, but at the height, maybe at like 10 a.m. in the morning, 11 a.m. in the morning, based on. So when with the permitting process, the Park Service, they sort of the space they allow you, they sort of estimate the square footage that a single individual will take up. Right. And so like you have to, and they ask you how many people are coming, and it was 1 million. Like that was what was in the permit. Like we expect 1 million people.
I need to see this permit.
Yeah. Right. It's like, it is part of congressional record. It's part of the public records. It's like, so 1 million people are coming. And so they mapped out like what 1 million people would look like. And we took up that space and more. So I side with the organizers who put the estimate, at least I will go with at least 1.2 million, upwards to 2 million. After the Park Service was sued, and as a result of that lawsuit, the Park Service decided they will never do official crowd counts again for any event happening. And that's why you will never find an official crowd count of any event after 1995 because of the Million Man March and what many people felt was their undercounting to diminish the impact and presence of that gathering.
Wow. So they were sued for the undercount.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I don't even know if the 3/5 thing made it in. I know that's how we were talking about. We were like,
right.
3/5 counting.
Right. Wow. So, okay. So, so it's October 16th, 1995, 1.2 to 2 million sort of Black men mostly, gather. And this is 25 years later, right? We're 25 years since then. And I guess, what was the impact, do you think, or the various kinds of impact of the march?
So you know, in transparency, one of my frustrations that led to me sort of like moving away from the organizing was the lack of what I thought was really strong follow up. And you know, and you know, looking back, I don't think any like we barely had the capacity to organize the march. Like, you know, I mean, they did get more computers, but it was still my little PowerBook book. And so the capacity to hold that and focus it and keep it going was just not there. And so as a result, I think many people felt like, oh, it was just a gathering. And because there was no legislation attached to it, they were, you know, the way that people, you know, sort of tagged the March on Washington in 1963 as a success is because of the policy results that people sort of felt came from it. But you know, there were some numbers, right? So in 1996 for the march, for the Million Man March, and in 1996, the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which is a think tank, they, you know, based on their studies, determined that between 1.5 and 1.7 more Black men voted in 96 than in 94 or 92. I think, sorry, 94. And so part of this is that like the off cycle, like, because 94 was an off cycle, but after they corrected for that, they were like, there is no other explanation that we can find that explains this significant uptick in Black men voting than the Million Man March. So that's like one of the concrete things. You know, we could talk about the value, what happened to that vote. Of course, it led to the reelection of Bill Clinton, and it's like, you know, but what else, you know, was that or dough? There, you know, the National Association of Black Social Workers reported an increased number of inquiries for Black families wanting to adopt Black children or foster Black children. Some of those actually happened. So that was one of the things that people responded to. A lot of organizations responded to or talked about increased involvement of members or people joining. You know, one of the things that Minister Farrakhan said, he didn't proselytize. He didn't tell people to join the nation. He told people, go join something, join an organization, join a mosque, join a community and get involved. And, you know, people did that. And of course, some of these things are measurable and quantitative, and some of it is qualitative. You know, the experience that people had and how that experience transformed them and how much that experience lingered. We know that without the structural support, these sort of transformative emotional experiences are hard to sustain, even with the best of intentions. So I don't want to overstate its case. I talked about, well, there was a decline in crime, and I'm like, well, there was also that crime bill that was just like taking up people off the street. So I don't want to claim that, but I do think that there was a spirit, you know, that was revived in 95, and that was felt in 97 with the Million Women March in Philadelphia, which was very much inspired along the same lines of women sort of taking up, you know, a space to work through how they want to articulate their role in this, for themselves, and also in communities and families. There were, of course, follow-up commemorations in 2000, the Millions Family March, in 2005, the Millions More movement, in 2010, the Justice or Else. You know, and then Million, everybody sort of like wanted to have a million something, a Million Youth March. I think there was a Million Youth March. There was like, I mean, even when the Women's March that happened in 2017 after after the election of the current president, the initial articulation of it by, I think, you know, some of the earlier white visionaries behind it was, we need to have a Million Women March, because of course they had completely
ignored it.
Yeah, completely ignored.
Happened.
You know, yeah. And once they were checked, they were like, well, we're just gonna have to call it the Women's March, right? So but million became this sort of metaphor for mass mobilizations.
Yeah. I think one of the things interesting though about this policy point you bring up, like the people saying that, the March in Washington had a set of policy demands attached to it, and why didn't the Million Man March have that? And I think it's interesting. I think, now I don't know, but I think it might also speak to about what, like, where do you think change happens? And, sort of, because, you think about right now, and we're in this election season, and all these things are going on, and from the pandemic to the protests we've seen across the country and across the globe, like policy is good, but policy is not enough, right? And I think, and policy also can be kind of chopped up, sliced and diced to where it doesn't actually do what you wanted to do in the first place. So it's interesting just to think about, is that a failing, right, of the march, or is that indicative of maybe a different kind of imagination around,
No, and I think, one of the things about the march, it was I call it crowdsourced. It was it was crowdsourcing before there was crowdsourcing. There was open source organizing. It was, like I said, we were at the national headquarters, we were sort of playing catch up with the people who were, folks were so excited. They took initiative. They were like, I'm just going to order a bus. I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to organize. Y'all don't got merchandise. We going to make a t-shirt. Right. So they were like, just thousands of different t-shirts for Million Man March. I mean, we gonna make our own poster. Like, people were just taking that initiative. And what this did was create a space for different kinds of organizers to emerge that were not part of the establishment politics. They had not come through a party system. They had not come through sort of, legacy leadership. This was just like grassroots folks. Like, if you could get a bus together, you could be a local organizing committee, right?
Right.
And so this, I think, this happened in '95. There was no widespread internet. There was no email. There was no, social media. The social media was Black talk radio and Black newspapers and the Black public commons, which is like the barbershop, the beauty salon, the schools, the churches, the mosques, the Elks lodges, the sororities, the fraternities, the Black college campuses and Black student organizations, the Black professional associations. That was the Black public commons that really provided the foundation for this organizing. And I think awakened to people that we don't have to wait for other people to organize us. And so I'm not saying that the march inaugurated that, but it certainly marked that moment. And so, following that, it's not surprising that the kind of organizing that we've seen that's been the most dynamic has really come in these what look to be spontaneous kinds of like self-initiated demonstrations and movements by people just using the word of mouth, because the march was spread by word of mouth. If you read newspapers in August and even in September of '95, in the mainstream press, people were this wasn't a story. This was not a story. People were like, I don't know anything about that. I hadn't heard about it. And when I say people, I mean white people, right? And white media was just like, I don't know nothing about this. This ain't gonna happen. And then like come the beginning of October, people are sort of like looking around, and maybe folks are calling in for their vacation time from work because it was on a Monday. It wasn't on a weekend. And, people start seeing these planes sell out, and they're seeing buses sell out. I mean, there were cities that ran out of buses, right? People start seeing the logistics. There were only a few of the Jumbotron screens, which are the big screens that you need so people can see at different distances. I think the Million Man March got all the ones that were in North America, right? Like, it was like 5 or 6 or something, right?
Right.
So, with that kind of happened, once that people started, they're like, oh, I think this is a story. And they started chasing after the story. But we didn't wait. No one waited for anyone to tell us to mobilize. And I think that's what the Million Man March showed me and reminded me, that you don't have to wait for someone to tell you to organize. And we've certainly seen that in the last 25 years. No one has waited for anyone to tell them to organize. People take that initiative, and the people that take that initiative often, demonstrate themselves to have a particular gifts of organizing that we would not have known about had we sort of looked at the traditional leadership. And it's interesting that, you know, most of our, I think what we've seen in these spaces emerge now is a significant role of women, of Black women as organizers, which we always knew. We just didn't get to hear from when they were, you know, when people looked in front of the camera. Right. And so I think that, you know, that kind of organizing is very powerful. And I think when you talk to organizers today, you know, they're not the end point for them is not electoral politics. The end point for them is not legislation. You know, part of what they're trying to do is really create and imagine a different kind of way for us to relate to each other. And so I think, you know, to the degree with all of its caveats, I think the Million Man March did that for a lot of the people who were in attendance.
Right. So we had this question earlier that I want to ask before we kind of wrap up. But so the question, you had made this point that you felt that the maybe for the first time in U.S. history, you were saying like the Black moral voice was a Muslim voice. Yeah. So this question was, how do we go about making the Muslim voice once again an amplified moral voice amongst Black people in America?
I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I could be an imam. No, just thank you for that question. You know, I always go back to look at the work that was being done. And I think, you know, the reason why people came to see Muslims, Black Muslims in the Black community as having this something to say and in a unique way to our crises was because of the work that they saw, the real work on the ground, right? Throughout much of the 80s, while our communities were being stripped of all of the public services, of what they call the social safety net, it was our religious communities that stepped in and provided the services that we had to depend on. And the unique thing about Black Muslims in the United States were so few, you know, like if you looked at a pie chart of like, you know, who your message is for African-American Muslims or Black Muslim communities, it's at least half and half, if not more dawah and then like self-service, right? There's such an emphasis on working with our people who are not Muslim. And I think, you know, many of these groups were still growing, right? Like you had the early Sunni communities that were sort of branching out maybe from Imam Muhammad's community. You had, you know, Shia communities that were sort of gaining their stronghold. You had the nation being rebuilt. And so all of that required a very active dawah, a very active missionary work. And I think, you know, we may have gotten to a critical mass where we're like, okay, we're a community now. So and I think it's good. We've had to focus on the infrastructure of our communities. But I think part of it is going to require us speaking into and working with and being present at where our people are. And I think we've seen that, right? There's been Muslims involved in like Black Lives Matter. There's also been people opposed to, you know, this sort of engaging in social justice work. And I think it is the work of all of our elders and pioneers who did that social justice work, who laid a groundwork for a reputation that Muslims enjoyed. So that when people knew, you know, people had these high expectations of Muslims. When Muslims come into the space, they expect knowledge, they expect wisdom, they expect understanding, they expect organized power, they expect a discipline, they expect refinement. And for those of people, I'm like sort of checking off the supreme mathematics, but they expect builders, they expect people who could destroy white supremacy, they expect people who will help us come to birth. No, they really expect all of these things from us. And I think we are, as the communities, we have been riding that for a very long time. And I think we've been working, a lot of us have been working to sort of renew it and revive it. But I think that that's what we're going to have to do. I think that the acknowledgement and recognition will come afterwards. I think that we just have to be active. You know, and there was also, you know, look, after the Million Man March, people got real nervous, right? They were like, oh, this Muslims called 1 million people. Like, what's, we got to diminish the influence of Muslims in the Black community. And there was a very famous preacher, Fred Price, who was a Black televangelist, who did a whole long series on Islam and Black America. Like, he went in and studied, the nation and Sunnis, and like he unpacked Islam in a way that only a Christian missionary could, right? And really went after Islam because there was an anxiety and panic about, for people who do this tribal version of religion of like, you can't take my followers, right? As opposed to, we just happy you saved a soul, right? And so, and some Muslims are like that too. We like keep score.
For true.
We're like, we gonna get a big trophy today. We got a shahada. And I think that we have to be more focused on the development of human beings. And I think the best of our tradition did that. And that is what people were responding to in 95. And I think they still respond to, but we have to really kind of be more present.
So I think the last question I have for you, which is a short one, it's just how do you think, maybe it's not that short, but how do you think, like, how should the Million Man March be remembered?
Well, for me, I think, and some of the stuff that I've mentioned, I think the power of grassroots organizing, that this was something that was only made possible by the work of the people, not of a people, but of the people. And that is, that's where you want to find out where freedom is. Freedom is found amongst the people. And I don't say that to valorize, because, a people can also become populist fascists, right? So like, I'm not valorizing crowds, right? But I say that the grassroots people who are closest to the problem have the best idea of what the solutions are. And among those people, they tend to be very nimble. They're not as dogmatic and sectarian as we would like them to be, right? And so I think it's important for us to not, when we look at our social movements, to not think about our social movements in terms of what leadership is saying, or even what leadership is publishing, but to think of social movements in terms of what people are doing on the ground. Because, even in the 1960s, people would go to a mosque meeting, then they would go to the NAACP meeting of their local chapter, and then they would go to a protest, right? And that same kind of nimbleness happened in the 70s. That same kind of nimbleness happened in the 80s. That same type of nimbleness happened with the Million Man March. The second thing I think is the story of the importance of Black media. Like one of the biggest boosts the Million Man March had was Black talk radio. People like Kathy Hughes and Bob Law in New York City. Bob Johnson, when BET, BET was still BET before it was sold to Viacom. BET gave the Million Man March one of its earliest platforms when they had Bev Smith, who was had a TV show called Our Voices. She did a special with Dr. Chavis, Cornel West, and Minister Farrakhan, and they put a 1-800 number, and that, like, our phones never stopped ringing after that, right? So the importance of Black media, and I think we see that in the way that people have been using social media to organize. And I think two more things. One is, there are times when we need to be reminded of our sense of linked fate, of peoplehood, of a sense of a national people, because we can become so fractured, that we start thinking like, does a Black America exist? And, look, we have family members that need to be talked to, who are making decisions right now that are imperiling our people, and we need to call them in and call them out. But the march showed that there was still a longing for that sense of peoplehood. The population of Black America in 1995 was about 33 million, according to the census. And if we say 1 million came to the march, that's 1 out of 33 people. That's like a chunk of Black folk, right? And then you count the people whose families sent folk, or the people who organized in their homes. Like, this was all of Black America, right? And then finally, I think we need to have these continued conversations around how we understand gender, and the roles that women and men play, how we even understand what women and, what manhood and womanhood is, ideas of gender and sexuality, and what are the promises of patriarchy, and can we have those promises without the patriarchy? Can we have partnership without patriarchy? Can we have protection without patriarchy? Can we have care without control? I think those are really important conversations that the march did not settle. It certainly, sort of triggered those conversations, but I think that we have to continue. And I think as a flashpoint, the march did that. I said that was the last one, but another last one, and this is the last one. This was the largest Black gathering in American history.
Wow.
And the fact that it's sort of, because of maybe its controversies and its distance in time or whatever, we've sort of forgotten about it or not talked about it, or we don't want to talk about it. Because even now, I'm like, my politics on gender has moved on since 95. And so I'm like, do I want to talk about the march? Do people going to think I'm like a Neanderthal and like I'm a caveman because I went to the Millionaire March, or I worked on the Millionaire March? And so like, even I have like these apprehensions about like how I think and talk about the march, but we can't erase this history. This is a powerful, powerful moment in Black America's history. This is a powerful moment in Black Muslim history, and a powerful moment of Muslim history in the United States. Mm-hmm. Like when people talk about Muslims in America, how many people talk about the Million Man March? To his credit, Ali Mazrui wrote this essay, and he talked about the Million Man March. The first thing that happened when that march opened was the call to prayer, was the adhan. And one of the last things that happened was when Minister Farrakhan recited Surah Al-Fatiha in Arabic, right? Never before, and I'm not kind of reaching for tokenized representation, but we got people who do. Y'all need to acknowledge that never before had the Adhan and Al-Fatiha been recited. And it wasn't just a million men gathered. This was covered, nonstop coverage by C-SPAN and CNN. It was watched around the world, not just around the country. And they watched a Black man, Sheikh Chajani, give the adhan in the morning, and another Black man, Minister Farrakhan, say Surah Al-Fatiha at the ending. And I think that if we can't recognize that for the significance of it, that it is for Muslims in the United States, we have robbed ourselves of an important historical legacy.
Thank you, Zaheer. And I mean, so that was his mic drop, just so y'all know, right? And I think that's a really amazing and really profound point for us to close on. I think, tonight you've kind of taken us on this journey, right? Of sort of how you as this young 22-year-old, sort of college student end up on this national committee, right? The context that created, right, the need or the desire to have this march, the feeling of the day, and why so many people came, and why so many people became connected, and and both the triumphs, but also some of the missteps or the failures, some of the things that didn't exactly go the way you think, or the way people would have wanted. And I think, 25 years later, I think, it's clear that there's still so much that we should learn and that we can get right from the Million Man March. And so I want to thank you for sharing your story with us today. I want to thank everyone for participating, for the questions and the comments. Zaheer talked about Black media and the importance of Black media. Well, Sapelo Square is Black media,
yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
And we do this, we're all volunteer organization. We do this for love. And so if you like what we do and you like this content, please support sapelosquare.com/donate. And we look forward to hearing more from you, Zaheer, as history editor. And, be sure to follow him. Let me put your, let me get this back. Let's follow him at Zaheer Ali, right, on social media. Of course, Sapelo Square is at Sapelo Square as well. And so with that, have a good night. Assalamu alaikum.